childless, and yet blameless before the Lord. So sometimes we can interpret not having as a condemnation from God, or we've done something wrong. The scriptures explicitly, time and time again, show people going through difficult times, and it's not their fault. That doesn't mean that bad things will happen to us. Sometimes it is our fault. But it means, spiritually speaking, there's not usually fault to be found when someone goes through profound suffering. Remember what Jesus said, a verse we never ever talk about. Where he says, do you think that the 52, that the tower fell down on them and they all died? Do you think they were less righteous than those around them? I tell you, no. And he says, these people suffered greatly, and it was no fault of their own. Zechariah and Elizabeth, blameless, but they could have no children. Thinking about Job, the most righteous man on the face of the planet, going through, now he's known for what? Not his righteousness, his great suffering. And so the suffering that we experience, we should not interpret, we would not interpret another's suffering as a punishment from God, but when we get in our own heads sometimes, I think I must be suffering because it's something I've done wrong. And that is, in my opinion, not a biblical concept. And certainly it does not line up with the story of Job. So let's think about Job for a second. His three friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. Incidentally, if there's anybody pregnant in your life right now and you think they need some help with names, we need a couple more Eliphazes around. And now, starting for the fifth grade team, Eliphaz Smith, and get him out there. When these three men heard about the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and to sympathize with Job. I've laid my clicker down someplace. There it is. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. Have you ever seen somebody so racked with grief? Their actual physical appearance had changed. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him, because they saw how great his suffering was. We're used to giving these guys a hard time because of stuff they say later in the book of Job. But we're going to pause here and see they got a lot of things right at the beginning. Those first 7 days, some things that we can learn about and we can learn from for sure. I gave men a hard time in the last session, so now I got to say some nice things about men. Otherwise, our egos will be bruised, right? So I got to say now, think about Job was an affluent man. Job's friends probably were also affluent men. And so when they come to him, imagine this is executives in suits, and they hear about everything that's happened to their friend Job. And these sorts of men leave their homes. They get out of their normal routine. They met together before they went and saw Job. They made an agreement. These men of affluence made an agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. Then they tear their suits. They rip their robes. And they weep out loud. Very different culture than what we're in today, but I think that those of us men in the room could learn from this point. That we would be willing to leave our normal day-to-day to meet together with other men even and say, let's go and sympathize with our friend. And that we would set aside the normal, our son is a public safety officer at Parkview. So he wears one uniform around Parkview. I'm usually in a suit. I didn't wear a suit today because it's going to be 1,000 degrees outside. So I'm in a polo today purposefully for that reason. But we've talked about when I walk around Parkview and I've got my badge and I've got my suit and I've got my tie and all of that, guess what people call me? Sir. And it dawned on me is because prior to being at Parkview, I didn't go to work in a suit most of the time. I was a church planter, so a t-shirt and jeans was all I could afford, So I didn't go around in an outfit like that. But when I started to work for Parkview and I started to put on the suit, people started to recognize me in a different way. And it's hard to let that go sometimes, to walk into a more tender spot. And so he's noticed too, when he walks around with his public safety officer uniform on, people also call him sir for a different reason. Plus he has much larger muscles than I do. So sometimes I should probably call him sir at this point. He's a bodybuilder and a rugby player, so you got to tip your hat a little bit. But I think putting this into perspective, as men of stature, men of means, that they shed that. They cried in a way that other people could hear, not just see them cry, they could hear them cry. They wept aloud, and then they sat with them for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one said a word to them. So let's extrapolate a little bit from this, because I think we do learn how to care here. What did they do? First of all, they sat down. Actually, you know what? We're going to back up to something that's not even on the slides, because it means something, I think, for your congregations. They made an agreement. So when we went around earlier, you said, we're putting grief share in place. We're starting a support group. We've got a bereavement ministry for when we have funerals. These are agreements that you have made. You've made an agreement. An agreement is how a system gets started, right? How a care system gets started, or how a care ministry or a Stevens ministry or a care pastor gets brought in. There's an agreement made that when people go through grief, this is an important thing to recognize and to support. So there's an agreement that was made by Job's friends. They decided ahead of time, this is what we're going to do. And so a lot of what we're talking about, and a lot of what we think about when we think about grief, is how do I be really nice to that person when I'm with them, right? But there's also systems that can be put into place. And many of you are part of those systems, or you facilitate those systems, and never underestimate how important the system actually is. At Parkview, when a patient dies, I told you we had this book as part of what we give to those patients, but there's a whole system of response there. Now, it's not a whole bereavement care process. Most of these people we're going to see for just a few moments, and then, unlike a congregation, we're probably not going to see them again. But we've got a system in place. A letter goes out that day. A letter goes out a year later. An invite goes out to a memorial service. So we know every time a person dies in our care, there's a cascade of results. Is it going to fix their grief? Not at all. Is it going to? Some of them are they even going to read any of the stuff we give them or pay attention to it? Probably only a small percentage really do. But we know when that happens, we've made an agreement, and of course for a health system, we've made policies. So we have policies of this is what happens for a person when they die. And in your congregation, you have some of these things too. So I know that, especially for those of you who are empathic, what you think about first is how can I care for that person that's in front of me emotionally, spiritually, but don't minimize the fact that you've got to make some of these systems, put some of these systems in place so that you're actually walking into that room. And so you're not trying to decide. So if you're on vacation you're on the beach in Florida and someone dies, but so you're not there to carry it yourself and to do the thing you usually do. Is there a system in place that's still going to make sure there's a funeral dinner, or that there's people who are praying, or there's people that are going to show up, or somebody's going to send flowers, or whatever agreement you've made ahead of time? Because if it rides on your shoulders, and your shoulders alone, and there's not been a larger agreement that's made, it will fall through the cracks sometimes. But if there's an agreement and there's a system that's made, and you say every time a person dies, or every time we hear about a miscarriage, or every time there's a funeral that's at our church building, if you decide ahead of time these are the things we do, that system never sleeps. You have to sleep as a human being. Systems can work all the time. If you've got those resources on board, if the next support group meeting is next week, and you can tell that person, hey, next Tuesday we're going to have the grief share group, we'd love to have you join us, that system is always in place, and you don't have to create it each time to try to figure out how to support that one individual person. Okay, so that's before we even get to this part. Then they come and they sit down. So there was a very interesting small study done years ago at the University of Kansas, where researchers followed a particular doctor around, and this doctor would go in and have a conversation with patients. And then after he left, the researcher would go in and say to the patient, ask the patient, how long do you think Dr. So-and-so was here? Try to estimate to the minute and the second about how long he was here in your perception. What the patients didn't know was that the plan was sometimes the doctor would come and stand at the bedside, and other times he would come in and he would sit down and talk with the patient. And they would time him, you see how long he actually was in there. And when they asked the patients afterwards, when the doctor stood next to their bed, they perceived him as being there for a shorter amount of time than he actually was. And when he sat down, they perceived him as staying for a longer period of time than he actually was. So just the fact that he wasn't just standing over them, something very spiritual about that posture and positioning, right? Of being willing to sit down with someone. You remember when Jesus and they bring the woman caught in the act of adultery and they throw her out in front of him. What does he do? He stoops down. He gets on her level and he's with her. So I don't know that Job's friends had read the study from the University of Kansas, but they intuitively knew, like when you come to somebody, a friend who's gone through the sort of grief that Job is going through right now, you don't stand over them. You naturally sit down and get level with them. Next, they wept out. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
My son just came back from Senegal,
Okay.
working with